Welcome to another episode of Unlocking California Politics. Today we are here with two of California's top political experts to discuss this upcoming election. We have with us Josh Walters, who has served in many different capacities in the state legislature for Democratic leadership and has been at the helm of many campaigns over the years. Welcome, Josh. And I would also like to welcome Rob Stutzman, who is a political expert and a longtime Republican strategist, who has also served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Schwarzenegger. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
Now, every 10 years, California and the rest of the country must redraw its electoral lines at the federal, state, and local government in response to the census. This upcoming election on June 7th will be the first election with the newly redrawn lines. In addition to the newly redrawn lines, and perhaps in some cases as a response to those lines, we are also seeing a great resignation take place in the state legislature. Over the past several months, there's been a historic number of resignations and announcements to not run for re-election in the state legislature. The result is about 40% of today's legislators will not be returning next year. On paper, at least, this all seems like it could result in dramatic change. There also seems to be a general disgruntlement, if you will, in the electorate as a whole. Based on all these factors, let me first start with, why do you think we are having this great resignation among our state legislators? Let's start with you, Josh.
Oh, thanks for having me. So, yeah, I mean, we have seen a number of folks just to say, hey, I don't want to do this job anymore. And it is really interesting, right? And what we're seeing is not necessarily, though, that folks are leaving the political realm altogether. So a lot of them are leaving to take, consulting or other type jobs in and around public affairs. So in some ways, it's just a shift of the type of role that they want to play, or the piece of the cog, so to speak, that they're going to play. So being an elected official, I think during the COVID environment wasn't necessarily a lot of fun or as exciting. I mean, a lot of the things that may draw you to politics, I mean, necessarily going to be a people person, right? And you're put in an environment where you don't get to go out, you don't get to see other people, you don't get to participate in events. You're essentially locked down and doing the job on Zoom. So I think that could be a factor. And then, at the same time, we're also seeing, you said a lot of disgruntlement. I mean, people are not happy right now. They're not happy with government. I know the number of polls I've seen, and I'm sure Rob's probably seen the same thing, is people are just generally mad. They're mad at everybody. They're mad at the Democratic Party. They're mad at the Republican Party. I mean, they are just mad. And so in an environment where often that anger is expressed at the elected officials that currently have it, it might be a good time just to say, hey, I'm going to step out of this role and let somebody else that wants to take it and figure out, a different role for me to play in government affairs. So.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything Josh said. There's a couple other dynamics as well. There's a confluence that's happening, not just of the redistricting, which casts members sometimes into completely different seats or seats where they don't actually live. They have to move. So it can be very disrupting to state legislators. But there's also a big term limit hit in the assembly that was going to happen in 24. And some of these resignations have been members that only have 2 more years to go. It has to be the district may have changed on them a little bit. And then I don't think we can underscore enough, Josh's point of how hard this job has been for these legislators during COVID. Not just the distance, the isolation, the hearings, going to the telephonic hearings have become chaotic. It's given access to people who otherwise, would not be testifying in legislative hearings. It's made a lot of them dysfunctional. And I just think I think tensions are high even amongst legislators on the way all this has been handled, just as it has been for almost anyone in their workplace over the last few years. So these are all contributing factors, but we're about to get these next 2 cycles really kind of two fresh classes in the legislature that will largely begin to define it here as we move through the rest of this decade.
I mentioned previously that there's a number of factors in the air, if you will, that with an electorate that is very disgruntled. Do either of you see any challenges to the supermajority status of the Democratic Party in either the Senate or the Assembly? I'll start with you, Rob.
I do not. I think the Democrats have a pretty good lock on that supermajority. The way the newest legislative maps, I think, will age over the decade, I think continue to favor Democrats. We are in an election cycle that's going to favor Republicans. And so you hear talk nationally of Republicans taking over the House and the Senate. Well, kind of the best that may mean here in California is Republicans maybe take a seat or two from Democrats, but there's some Republicans in some very tough seats they have to defend now because of redistricting. So I don't see much changing, and I think our politics in California, at least legislatively, will continue to move towards this model of really more factions and caucuses and coalitions within the supermajority of Democrats that control the legislature.
Thanks, Rob. How about you, Josh?
I think Rob's exactly right here. I mean, I think the supermajority is essentially here to stay for the foreseeable future. And frankly, I think one of the reasons that is just because of, partially to blame the redistricting process, right? And the way that carries out. And that can be a conversation for another day. But yeah, I mean, I think we're locked in here. And so then the question is how do we figure out ways to operate in this environment and to build coalitions, of folks in the different, either houses of the legislature and such forth. So, for example, I mean, I think the Senate tends to be thought of as a little bit more moderate place right now. And so I think folks from the business community are interested in trying to maintain that status in the Senate. And then the question is are we able to go into and build coalitions in the Assembly as well, where we can have, essentially a working house that, can represent, both, business and labor, interests and manage that. Right now, it just seems to be pretty much just labor feels represented. At least folks in the business community feel that way. And I don't think they're wrong to feel that way at all.
Thanks. One of the issues we've seen within the Democratic Party, of course, is between this sort of split between the more moderate elements and what I guess you might want to call the Sanders or left wing of the Democratic Party. How do you think that's going to play out in the next legislature? Let's go with you, Josh.
Well, I mean, I think folks in the business community, it's incumbent upon, and certainly my clients, and I work with, the realtors are part of this too, is, we need to come in and figure out, how can we find folks in Democratic districts that are Democrats and have core Democratic values, but at the same time are willing to come to Sacramento and, represent business interests too, and, hear the other side of things and understand, the employers, have an important role to play in the employee-employer relationship, right? And so that's what we need to do. And I think there's an opportunity now with the so-called Great Resignation of 2022 and the term limits that Rob mentioned in 24 is to try and find those folks and work to get them elected. And so, and it's an interesting, year in that, sometimes you'll look and in the Bay Area, there's a young man that's running for assembly in the 20th Assembly District. And, and he's LGBTQ. He has experience working, as a legislative staffer, but at the same time, he's considered the moderate candidate. And he's a fairly progressive individual, but at the same time, in the Bay Area, this is somebody that's a little bit more middle of the road. He's a Navy reservist. So has that military background as well. So can pick up some Republican votes. So it's about finding folks like that, that are willing to sit down and have conversations and relationships with business and trying to get them to run. Right. And so, and that's just a challenge in and of itself, is trying to find good quality people that want to come up and do the job in the first place. So that's a challenging part as well.
Rob?
It'll be interesting to see in this election cycle how Democrats, particularly suburban Democrats, feel that the issues on criminal justice, crime, and homelessness affect politics. And I think that will then could affect policy come next year. I mean, you're in a legislature now where a Democrat with law enforcement background, Assemblyman Jim Cooper, is pushing for certain crimes to be considered violent crimes that most people would think, oh, that's a violent crime, raping someone when they're unconscious or domestic violence. But in fact, under California law, they're not considered violent crimes. Bill doesn't get out of committee, right? So, and he goes off about it publicly. So there's, that's an example where these Democrat tensions are showing. And on homelessness and homeless policy, Democrat moderate Mr. Assemblyman Villa Dupois had a bill that would allow housing money to go to nonprofits that require sobriety of their clients, like the St. John's Shelter here in Sacramento. And, progressive chair of the housing committee won't even give the bill a hearing. So these are types of Democrat conflict that I've never seen in my, hate to say, now fourth decade observing numerically and watching this. So we're in a little bit of new territory with, again, that supermajority. The stress becomes between moderate and progressive Democrats. Progressives, I think, will maintain an upper hand, obviously, through this year. But it'll be interesting to see when you get a new crop up here, and if it's a particularly punishing election cycle on these issues, if some things might be different come 2023.
Well, and actually, if I can follow up on that, I mean, to Rob's point, I mean, this is the first election cycle. We've been on crime in a very progressive, shift, right? And now we're seeing where voters are not so happy with candidates maybe that take a defund the police position, right? And this is in a Democratic race. So we're starting to see, these things where it had shifted super progressive, and now being with those groups are maybe a liability in 2022. So again, nationally, we're going to see a shift towards Republicans. We're not going to get a big red wave in California because we don't really get waves necessarily here in California, but the crime issue is definitely relevant, and it's definitely moving back towards the middle. So, and again, we're seeing it play out in campaigns right now where Democrats are being hit or attacked for being in a defund position, and the polling shows that it could work.
You both have mentioned the national climate, which favors Republicans. Within California, you've got crime issues, gas prices, a whole slew of issues that you would think the Republican Party would be able to use to maybe make some inroads. But neither of you seem to think that that's likely or possible. And perhaps a discussion as to why. I'll start with you, Rob.
Well, the Republican Party still has a national brand problem in California. And that national brand problem includes the Republican leader, who's from California. So as much as there is, the president's unpopular in California, the vice president, who's from here, is unpopular in California, according to public polling we've all seen. So Californians are upset and anxious about all the issues that people are nationally when it comes to inflation. They're disappointed with the president. The withdrawal from Afghanistan had hurt this president deeply. That's all baked in here too. But on top of that, crime and homelessness are off the charts in California. And that, particularly homelessness, is much more a unique California dynamic. And then there's crime that comes off of the homelessness issue as well, particularly the petty crime, as we've seen proliferating, not just in the urban core, has been in the exurban and the suburbs. So, these are issues that lead to political earthquakes. However, if the Republican endorsed candidate, Senator Dawley, is their nominee or in the runoff with Gavin Newsom, he'll be underfunded. He has no name ID, and he comes from the most rural part of the state with no context for addressing any of these issues. So I think Republicans have just stepped back from being able to be competitive because it just seems so far out of reach. Their donors don't believe that they can get there. Therefore, no one who would be a more qualified candidate really steps up to run. To me, the interesting path, real quick, and to just full disclosure, I am the consultant to two no party preference candidates, independents. One running for Attorney General, Anne-Marie Schubert. One running for Governor, Michael Schellenberger. That to me is a more plausible path because both of those people poll very competitively in general elections. And in Schellenberger's case, he's left of center virtually on all issues and becomes a very intriguing type candidate. He's largely unknown, and there hasn't been much independent expenditure effort behind him. So I don't know how that will go. But for the future of California politics, I think it comes from something more from the center than seeing Republicans research. They don't seem capable of doing so.
Josh?
No, I think what Rob said makes exact sense, right? But the challenge that we have, and I don't think it's bad that folks from the, the no party preference are potentially the way forward. But the challenge that we have is trying to figure out how to get people, that aren't affiliated with a party through the primary system, right? So in California, we have an open primary, so you can vote for whichever candidate that you want. But as we've seen in the recent past, people still think of it as a primary, right? So if you're a no party preference voter, a lot of folks just think, oh, this isn't for me. The Democrats go vote for the Democrat, the Republicans go vote for the Republican, right? So part of the strategy is, how can we figure out, to get folks that aren't affiliated with a party through the process and so that they are in the general election. And I think that would be good for California and frankly, good for our electoral system. But that's the challenge that we have. And I'm glad Rob and others like him are working on that because I think it's really important.
So one more question in that vein. I saw a poll recently which showed that I think the three most popular governors in the country are the Republican governors of deep blue states. I think in Maryland, Massachusetts, I want to say Vermont.
It's Vermont, yeah.
Vermont. So why do you think it is that the California Republican Party can't sort of replicate that type of success that's occurred in those states? And I'll start with you, Josh.
Well, I mean, California is just a unique place. I mean, we are, we always want to be our own way. We want to do things our own way. I mean, we just think of ourselves differently. So, a model that works in other places doesn't necessarily apply here. I mean, we're 40 million folks. It's just a gigantic state and it's very diverse. And frankly, we have a lot of Democrats here, the way the districts are cut up, it's just the districts aren't set up for Republicans to be successful, right? And that's just kind of the reality of how it is. And so we have to find a different model in order to, bring balance back to our electoral politics here. And I think that involves, finding a way for candidates that are in the middle to move forward, whether they're no party preference candidates, whether they're Democrats that are more business minded. I mean, I think that's the challenge that we have to figure out in order to essentially moderate California and get it more back to the center, where frankly, most of the voters tend to be, right? We just, people in electoral land and professionals such as us, create this divisive choice where you have to pick this extremist or the other extremist. And we have to figure out, how do we move things towards the middle? And frankly, I know there's a lot of folks that are working on doing this in 2022 and 2024. We've seen that as the challenge and we're working towards that goal. So.
Right.
So part of the reason this hasn't happened in California is because it's a little difficult to explain the scale of expense it requires to win like that in California. So the states that you've described where this happens, Maryland, Massachusetts, Vermont, not super cheap states necessarily. There's some big media markets there, but nothing like what you'd have to do in California. So, which means you really have to get to a self-funder. So 12 years ago, we had that with Meg Whitman. I worked on that campaign. But she was also following the second term of a Republican governor, and the state was ready to go back in in that election cycle, go back to a Democrat governor who was fairly moderate in a lot of ways, Jerry Brown. So if someone like that comes along again, that could be interesting. But you have to be able to overwhelm in spending because it's not just about your own name ID. You have to beat back the tactic that we've seen employed by the front-running, well-funded Democrats this cycle and the last cycle, and frankly, even 20 some odd years ago, where they take and elevate the unelectable Republican. So Gavin Newsom elevated John Cox 4 years ago to avoid a runoff with Antonio Villaraigosa by quote unquote attacking him with ads on Fox News, calling him pro-life, pro-gun. He's doing the exact thing right now with Brian Dahle. He's building Brian Dahle's name ID as a pro-life, pro-NRA to conservatives. So they know, oh yeah, that's who we vote for. And then, Dahle's top vote getter and the election essentially is over. Labor-backed groups are doing the same thing in the AG's race, backing a complete unelectable, election conspiracy nut, Eric Early, who has virtually no money, by attacking him in the same manner, because then their race is over. They don't have to worry about running against Anne-Marie Schubert or even Nathan Hochman for that matter. So you have to have enough money if you're running for governor to overcome that type of tactic as well. So basically, yeah, you need to be independently wealthy and ready to burn 150, $200 million, which just sounds absurd. And it kind of is, which is why it hasn't happened in 12 years.
All right, thanks. So you both have mentioned, I think, crime as one of the central issues, homelessness. What are the other issues that you think are moving voters in this season? I'll start with you, Rob.
Well, prices, particularly street inflation. So food prices, and in California, energy prices. There's an awareness in California that we pay more at the pump than you do in other states, and I think that is really motivating people. Gasoline is always a volatile issue. When it gets to a certain price, we drive by the prices daily, many times a day, and then once a week you have to stop and fill up that tank, and all of a sudden you're looking at numbers on that gas pump that you've never seen before in your life. So these are very motivating. I think food prices as well, and I've seen numbers recently about wrong track in California where it's political earthquakes can really happen, and I do think inflation on top of the homelessness and crime is a volatile cocktail. I just don't know if there's going to be any candidates that really benefit from it. That are not incumbents.
Josh, anything you would add to those?
Well, the other issue that I keep seeing pop in polls, relates to this cost of housing too, right? So, and access to housing, cost of housing. So that's important one. I mean, I think the challenge there is it's such a large issue that folks don't necessarily believe that a different state senator or assembly member is going to fix that problem, right? I mean, it feels more systemic at this point. So.
Rob, would you agree with that with respect to housing?
I agree. Housing, particularly rent. The tricky thing about housing on housing prices politically is, it's also how middle class builds its wealth traditionally in California. And so, if you're trying to get access to the market, the run up in the last few years is very discouraging and upsetting. If you're already in the market, you've accumulated a fair amount of wealth over those last few years. And so these are one of the factors that further complicates housing, I think, from a public policy perspective for elected officials.
Something which is unlikely to happen before the primary election, meaning a decision about Roe versus Wade. But let's say prior to the general election, a decision comes down. Do you see that impacting the election in any way? If there's a overruling of Roe versus Wade? And I'll start with you, Josh.
I mean, I think we're sure to see folks on the left try to use this as a rallying call to boost turnout. And I think that, the progressives on the Democratic side are concerned that, this could be a very low turnout year. We have, nothing particularly exciting on the ballot so far. We know who's going to be reelected to be the governor. It kind of feels a little bit like 2014 did when Governor Brown was up for reelection. It was a really, really low turnout election, and low turnout elections can mean Republican wins, in close races, right? Just because it's the Democrats that tend to surge, on higher turnouts, and then that drops off. So I think we're sure to see, folks on the left use this as a rallying cry to try and turn out their voters and keep turnout up in order to protect those competitive races.
Rob, what do you think?
Well, I agree with Josh. I mean, it will have an impact. How big an impact is a little difficult to bake in yet. Democrats need an issue to rally their base. As Josh said, the president's unpopular with young Democrat voters. The most pro-choice voters in the country are young voters. So, I agree. They're going to try to use it for turnout. How well it works, we just don't know. I talked to colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and abortion has been this issue that no elected has ever had to worry about casting a vote on over the last 50 years. So in some ways, we don't quite know even how the voters might react to all of this. So there's a lot that will play out here, but it certainly is a factor.
Recently in San Francisco, we had a recall of the members of the school board, and there's currently a recall movement over their, let's say, controversial district attorney. But in terms of the recall effort, the successful recall effort of the school board, how do you think has that had a broader impact? What kind of impact do you think that's had on statewide politics? And I'll start with you, Josh.
Well, recalls are just really tricky. I mean, right? I mean, they're not necessarily a global thing. They're often very local, very localized issues. So, I mean, I think school board and with COVID and students and children, I think that's just kind of it's just a pressure cooker there. So you're seeing that. San Francisco is its own political environment. And then you mentioned, recalls against district attorneys. And we're seeing that, both in San Francisco, down in Los Angeles. And I think that speaks to Rob's point that, crime is front and center on this electoral cycle, right? And this is kind of the shift back from, very progressive, what we would call the social justice, type criminal policies. And now you're seeing folks that are frankly victims of crime or knowing people that are victims of crime. We're seeing the shift back toward people rebelling against that, and then rebelling against who they think the policymakers are that put them in that situation. So, I mean, I don't see recalls kind of spilling over into the assembly or the Senate or other elected, offices on the state level. I think these are very specific examples driven by very, specific situations and results.
Thanks. Rob?
Well, I agree with that. I mean, the school board, there's a woke aspect there there's backlash to, and it's coming from obviously very liberal voters in San Francisco. Sure. I mean, other elected officials are taking note of that. With these DA recalls, we're seeing it affect, I think, other locals. The very progressive mayors of San Francisco and Oakland are making the point that they are, in fact, for funding the police. So it's all having an impact on the political environment. And I think we'll see a recall qualify in Los Angeles, whether that election takes place in November or sometime thereafter. DA Gascon appears to be in trouble as well. And you've got businessman, billionaire mayor candidate down there, Rick Caruso, who's able to self-fund and has vaulted himself into the lead around all of these issues. Which a year ago, I think people had trouble seeing Caruso getting all the way to the top of that pack. So, yeah, these recalls have sent a message. I agree with Josh. I don't think you'll see a proliferation of them. These two, one recall and the prospective recall, are sending the message that is intended.
So are there any things we should be looking for on the primary election night that might be indicative of some sort of change, or like, are there particular races that might indicate some sort of a break in the electorate, or would be a particularly of importance on election night? And I'll start with you, Josh.
Well, I'm gonna say one of Rob's races. I'm gonna say the Attorney General's race. I mean, to me, it's a great race. We have some great candidates that are running. We have a no party preference candidate that's eminently qualified, and and I think should make it to the November election. And the question is, can she, right? And so to me, I think that's just a test of the system, and a strategy in trying to fix the system and help make it work. So for me, that's going to be the number one place I'm looking.
Oh, that's interesting. Rob?
I agree, of course, with Josh's assessment on that race. I would watch to see what Gavin Newsom's number is. I mean, he's running against a long list of candidates who really don't have much name ID. Brian Dahley's been endorsed, and Newsom is elevating him. Mike Schellenberger, who I already noted I'm working with, has garnered a lot of attention and a lot of earned media. I think those two will probably vie for the second spot. But watch Newsom's number, and it'll be interesting if it hovers in the under 45%. It says something about, I think, the mood of the state. And then I already mentioned the LA mayor's race. Absolutely keep an eye on that. And then also I would watch the sheriff's race in LA County. Very controversial sheriff there. And if he survives, if he wins, and that's a June race, if he wins, it really says something about how people are prioritizing law enforcement at the moment.
Yeah, that would be interesting. You're right. He is a controversial candidate. It'll be interesting to see if it's all over the map, though. But okay. A lot of our members are fairly active in terms of voting. you have any tips for how you think they can help energize and get their own family, friends, clients, etc., energized to vote in the election? I'll start with you, Rob.
Yeah, so a ballot like this is confusing because unless you live in Los Angeles or the San Francisco market where you're seeing recall ads, you don't even know, you didn't know there was an election. Because once we moved ballot measures out of June and into November, we lost all the advertising volume that really alerts people to elections. So these ballots have now arrived on the 9th, or they were sent out on the 9th of May. And people are opening them and they are seeing these long lists of names they had known nothing about for governor, for United States Senate. Alex Padilla, who's been appointed, is running for re-election. So his name ID isn't even all that high. And then I think there's 20 some odd names on there for US Senate. So it's very confusing and bewildering. So the best thing, frankly, you can do to help people is do the research to help them answer the questions about who are the top candidates, who can be ignored, and then, be able to share information about those candidates. I think family and friends would find that very helpful because to most Californians, this is a bewildering ballot.
Josh?
I think that's great advice. I mean, and I think realtors obviously are well positioned to provide that advice. I mean, we have, the Realtor Party. I'm a big fan of it. Often get involved in races where I'm active in, and it's always a good help. So I think, it's nonpartisan. It's just a rational approach to making California better. So I think, your members are great messengers along that front. So if they're able to give people a reason, I have friends reach out to me and say, okay, give me your slate. Who should I be voting for? So, if the realtor members are out there doing that, I think that's a great help to all California.
And in that Realtor Party vein, I'm wearing a purple tie, by the way. So just to be clear.
Perfect.
So just in conclusion, Josh, any final thoughts about the California political scene you want to share?
No, just being active and being involved and getting out and voting are critical, right? So we need, folks that are, want California to succeed or middle of the road, understand that we need moderate voices in Sacramento. We need to mobilize them and get them out. So, please do that. Please get your members to play that role. It's very important. So. And
Rob?
Well, I would echo that. There's those that are mindful of business, I think, have a oversized voice in this election that is underway right now. I think engagement is low, means turnout could be lower. Everyone does have a ballot at home, but once it's lost, it's lost. So those that are paying attention, are informed, and are recruiting people to vote, can be more influential than they may be in other elections.
All right. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Josh. This has been really great. I think our members are going to really enjoy your insights. And thank you again for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.